The studio lights hummed softly, the red on-air sign glowing like a silent warning. Kim Taehyung sat across from the host, his hands resting lightly on the table, fingers flexing occasionally, betraying a nervous rhythm beneath the surface. The conversation had started light about his music, his inspirations, his latest project, but the shift was inevitable, subtle, and deadly. The host leaned forward, eyes glinting with curiosity and a hint of mischief. Taehyung, the question came slowly, deliberately. Can we talk about your mother? Time fractured. His smile faltered, collapsing into a raw, unguarded silence. The room seemed to shrink, the microphones amplifying every faint echo, the electrical hum of the equipment mixing with the tension that thickened like fog around him. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick. The smell of the studio lights, warm and metallic, grounded him to the present yet reminded him of every past he had tried to lock away. Taehyung's fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest, knuckles whitening, a habit he had never been able to shed when panic crept up uninvited. "Cut," he whispered under his breath, not to the host, not to the producers behind the glass, but to himself, as if the single word could rewind the moment before it had ever happened. They didn't cut. The host blinked, curiosity sharpening into something dangerous. The producer's hand hovered above the switch, uncertain. Taehyung lowered his gaze to the table, noticing the faint scratch his ring had left moments before, and suddenly the studio dissolved around him. He was eight again, seated on the cold kitchen floor, listening to the rhythm of rain tapping against a cracked window while his mother hummed a melody she never finished. She had smelled of laundry soap and coffee, and when she smiled, it was always with a gentle weariness that made him want to be braver than he felt. That memory, warm and fragile, had always been both his refuge and his fault line. He swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice controlled but thin when he finally spoke. "Why now?" The host began to respond, but Taehyung raised a hand. "You said this interview was about music." The host nodded too quickly, stammering. "It is, but fans have questions, rumors," his voice faltered. Behind the glass, the producer's phone buzzed urgently. Their faces drained of color as they read the messages flashing across the screen. The rumors were no longer whispers. They were coordinates, dates, and names, now thrust into the studio where they did not belong. Taehyung felt a flare of anger, sharp and precise, followed immediately by the familiar undertow of guilt. He had spent years crafting a life of control, control over his music, his privacy, his own pain. This intrusion violated the sanctuary he had built. He thought of his mother's hands guiding him across the piano keys he barely dared touch, her late nights working so he could dream bigger. "I'm done," he said, standing abruptly. The chair scraped a shrill protest against the polished floor. The host murmured something, but Taehyung ignored it. The producer slammed the switch. The red light extinguished, and silence filled the room like a physical presence, heavy and absolute. His breath shuddered, grounding himself in the quiet, reclaiming what little ownership he had left over the moment. Ending the interview wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a declaration, boundary, survival. He picked up his jacket, pausing for a fraction of a second to glance back at the empty chair. "Some stories," he murmured to no one, "are not entertainment." The studio doors opened and the night air hit him, cold, metallic, carrying the sour tang of rain-soaked asphalt. Camera shutters exploded like gunfire. Voices shouted over each other, a cacophony demanding answers, speculation, explanation. "Taehyung, is it true about your mother? Why did you walk out?" He did not stop. A hand grabbed his sleeve reflexively and he yanked free, his eyes flashing with a dangerous restraint. "Don't touch me." The crowd hesitated, half a beat long enough for security to form a protective wall, guiding him into the waiting van. Inside, the darkness was suffocating yet familiar. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers pressing into his temples, as if by sheer force he could hold his racing thoughts together. Across from him, his manager, Yeho, stared like he was seeing a stranger. "What the hell was that?" Yeho finally demanded. "You don't just walk out of a live broadcast." "They crossed a line," Taehyung said quietly. They mentioned my mother. That's not a line to cross. It's a state secret. Yeho's jaw tightened. You promised me. You said they wouldn't go there. The van lurched as traffic carried them forward. The producer's phone buzzed again. Headlines flashed. The truth about Taehyung's mother. Why he walked out. Family secrets exposed. His chest tightened, pressure building like a fist constricting his heart. Taehyung flipped through the messages, his mind a whirlpool of anger and disbelief. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone knew. He had protected her memory meticulously, and now it had been dragged into the public, weaponized without his consent. The van pulled into the underground garage of his building, concrete pillars passing like prison bars. As he stepped into the stale air of his apartment, it smelled too controlled, too clean. Awards lined the shelves, a silent reminder of a life built on perfection. A piano sat in the corner, closed, silent. He dropped his jacket, splashed water on his face, gripping the edge of the sink as if he could anchor himself through the contact. His reflection stared back, pale, eyes rimmed red. Exhaustion, tension, grief, he looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in years. His phone buzzed again, a number he recognized. He let it ring, twice, then answered, voice steady but wary. Who is this? A calm, deliberate female voice. You shouldn't have walked out. His pulse spiked. How did you get this number? I've had it for a long time. Who are you? Another pause, deliberate. Someone who knew your mother. The weight of the words hit him and he sank into the chair, gripping the phone tightly. That's not funny, he whispered. You can call me Hana, she continued, and you have 24 hours before everything becomes public. The line went dead, leaving silence thicker than anything he had ever felt. Memories of his mother, the hospital, her quiet sacrifices, the fears she bore silently, they all rose unbidden. The city outside was indifferent, rain still drumming against the windows, masking the chaos of the headlines that had already exploded online. Taehyung sank deeper into the chair, the phone still warm in his hand. Hana's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. 24 hours. The clock had started, and every second now carried the weight of exposure. Why? He whispered to himself, fingers tracing the rim of the cup in front of him untouched. Why bring this now? He knew the answer even before Hana had spoken. It was never about timing. It was about leverage. And now he was the leverage. He pulled his jacket back on, packing the apartment, bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. His eyes scanned the room obsessively, every corner, every shadow. Security wasn't enough. Not when the truth had already slipped into the hands of strangers with agendas. His phone buzzed again, notifications flashing like strobe lights, but he ignored them, forcing his mind to focus on what mattered. Understanding, controlling, surviving. Finally, he made a decision. He needed answers from the only person who could give them without hesitation, his father. The call connected, and the voice on the other end was older, lined with years of unspoken regret. Taehyung, his father said, tone hesitant, cautious. I need the whole truth, Taehyung said, calm but firm. The line was heavy with static and the weight of years. His father sighed, the sound carrying the burden of secrets that had festered too long. I knew enough to be afraid, he admitted. That's not an answer, Taehyung said sharply. Silence filled the line. Finally, his father spoke, voice lower, almost a whisper. Your mother, she wasn't just your mother. The words landed like a hammer blow. Taehyung's chest tightened, his fingers gripping the phone like a lifeline. Don't say it like that, he snapped, the raw edge in his voice breaking through his usual control. She was involved in things, dangerous things, his father continued, hesitant, guilt-stricken. I begged her to leave, but she believed she could control it. Taehyung's mind raced, pieces clicking together like shards of glass, forming a picture he had never wanted to see. Memories he had dismissed as mundane or protective suddenly transformed into clues. Each detail now loaded with meaning. The way she switched languages effortlessly on the phone, the tension in her shoulders when strangers knocked, the late nights spent typing, the cautious glances. You're saying she was a spy. His voice was a whisper, disbelief threading through every syllable. "I'm saying she was idealistic, stubborn, smarter than anyone else in the room," his father said, voice cracking. "She thought transparency could prevent violence. She underestimated greed." Images flooded Taehyung's mind. His mother at the kitchen table, piles of documents around her, her hands flying across a keyboard in a rhythm of secrecy and urgency. The revelation hit like a tidal wave, and he sank back against the counter, breathing shallow and quick. "Why didn't you tell me?" Taehyung whispered, voice trembling. "Because you loved her, and because they were watching," his father said softly, and the weight of that statement pressed on him like a physical force. "Watching who?" he asked silently, rage building, fear sparking behind it. His father didn't answer. "Dad, I need the names," Taehyung said, voice rising. The line went dead. The silence of the disconnect was deafening. The apartment felt too small, walls closing in. The phone buzzed again. "Hana." "You planned this," he said immediately. "I accelerated the inevitable," she replied calmly. "The interview was bait. You took it." "Why?" His jaw clenched. "Because they're moving again," she said, "and your name is leverage." Taehyung laughed bitterly, almost in disbelief. "My name, my fame, that's leverage." "Yes, untouchable physically, but reputational destruction is precise, efficient, and deadly," she said. "I'm giving you a choice your mother never had, silence or exposure, on your terms, not theirs." He leaned back against the window, forehead pressed to cold glass, city lights reflecting like a million tiny accusations. "You said you knew her," he murmured. "She saved my life," Hana said softly, "and I failed to save hers." The words struck him silent. He felt the pull of responsibility, the inheritance of courage and consequence she had left him. He agreed to meet her, setting a time and place, far from managers and security. It was reckless, necessary. By evening, the city had become a storm of speculation. Hashtags, rumors, old interviews dissected, and his every lyric analyzed under a lens of conspiracy. He moved through the crowd at the cafe with quiet precision, hood up, cap low. The heartbeat of the world pressed against him with each step, but he was moving on instinct. Hana arrived with no preamble, older than he expected, eyes sharp and assessing. Her gaze carried the weight of truth, the gravity of everything they had hidden. "You look like her," she said quietly. Taehyung stiffened. "Don't," he replied, voice tight. She slid into the seat across, anger tempered by determination. "Tell me everything," he said, leaning forward. She studied him for a long moment before speaking, revealing the depths of the danger his mother had navigated, uncovering financial ties between powerful investors and illegal operations, her pregnancy, the threats, the forced disappearance. She had tried to live quietly. They had made her vanish anyway. "They waited until she was no longer useful," Hana said softly. Taehyung's fists curled tightly, heart hammering. "And now they want me," he whispered. "My silence or my obedience." "I'm not silent," he said, voice dangerous, eyes burning. "They chose the wrong person." Taehyung left the cafe soaked in rain, hoodie plastered to his back, shoes squelching against the wet pavement. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his mother's secrets had fused to his bones. The city was alive around him, horns blaring, sirens wailing, the low roar of endless engines. But he felt insulated, alone in a bubble of tension and fear. Back in his apartment, the door clicked shut behind him. The space smelled of stale air and cold wood, familiar yet alien after the revelations of the evening. He paused at the threshold, heart hammering, and let the silence envelop him. Security cameras blinked innocently, but he knew that nothing was truly secure anymore. Someone had already known. Someone had already watched. Taehyung moved to the piano instinctively, fingers hovering above the keys, hesitant. Music had always been his sanctuary, the one language in which he could sort chaos into something coherent. Tonight, it was therapy, strategy, and warning all at once. He struck a low chord, letting it vibrate through the room. It resonated like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The phone buzzed incessantly. Calls, messages, notifications, all a tidal wave of speculation and curiosity. He ignored them. Each buzz was a reminder they were watching, waiting, pushing. The weight of fame was suddenly weaponized, twisting his life into an open ledger for anyone who wanted to read. Hana's warning had been clear: silence or exposure. Taehyung chose neither. He would face this on his terms. He sat at the edge of the piano bench, fingers tracing the keys lightly, mapping the rhythm of his racing thoughts. Each note struck was a calculated step in reclaiming control, a declaration of intent to those who would manipulate his mother's memory for power. Hours later, dawn crept into the apartment. The city awoke to a world already in turmoil. Social media had erupted overnight. Headlines screamed of mystery, scandal, and conspiracy. Clips of his earlier interviews circulated, dissected by commentators and analysts. Every word, every pause, every gesture scrutinized as if he were both culprit and victim. Taehyung did not flinch. He did not react. He absorbed it. He analyzed it. He planned. Yeho arrived quietly, footsteps soft against the floor. His eyes scanned the room, noting the scattered papers, the open piano, the exhaustion etched deep into Taehyung's face. "They're digging," Yeho said softly. "Old interviews, every lyric, every appearance. They're trying to discredit you." "They're trying," Taehyung said, voice low, almost amused in its quiet defiance. "But they don't understand. They never did." The morning passed in strategic silence. Calls were made, messages sent, files organized. Hana had provided detailed information, evidence of corruption, and documents tracing illegal activities tied to influential individuals. Every revelation was a piece of the puzzle. Every piece sharpened the edge of his resolve. By midday, Taehyung prepared for a live broadcast. No scripts, no lawyer's pre-approval, just truth. The studio was colder than he expected, air conditioning humming, lights brutal and unyielding. He sat straight-backed, eyes steady, hands folded on the desk. The microphones glinted like silver teeth, the cameras unblinking, immortalizing every detail. "Are you ready?" Yeho asked, standing behind him, a shadow of concern in his eyes. Taehyung nodded. "I've never been more ready." The broadcast began. His voice was calm but edged with steel, cutting through the digital ether and into living rooms, offices, and devices worldwide. "Yesterday, an interview crossed a line," he began. "A line that should never have been crossed. My mother's name was used as entertainment, speculation, and manipulation. Tonight, I speak to reclaim the truth." The comments exploded almost instantly. "What does he mean? Shocking revelation. Who is he protecting?" Taehyung ignored it all. He focused on the narrative, the rhythm of his words, the cadence that would carry not only information but weight, responsibility, and integrity. He spoke of choices, threats, and the subtle violence of silence imposed on those who dared to defy power. He detailed corruption without naming names initially, framing the story in terms of principles and consequences. Every pause, every deliberate inflection was a warning and a promise. The truth would not be silenced. Somewhere in the control room, producers panicked. Comments piled up in real time, networks buzzed with anxiety. Analysts tried to interpret his pauses, his inflections, every move. But Taehyung was untouchable in his calm. He controlled the narrative with precision, walking the fine line between revelation and survival. Hours passed. By the time the broadcast ended, the world had shifted. Not entirely, but enough. Conversations erupted in offices, online forums, and households. Some cheered, some feared, some plotted. And through it all, Taehyung remained in the studio, eyes steady on the piano, fingers lightly tracing the keys as if the music itself could enforce the order of things. The phone buzzed again. "Hana, they're panicking," she said. "You've disrupted the equilibrium." "I didn't disrupt it," Taehyung said, voice calm. "I exposed it." A long silence followed, then softer, more measured. "Your mother would be proud." Taehyung smiled thinly. A dangerous curve of his lips. "I don't need pride," he murmured. "I need the story to be heard." The day blurred into night. Security protocols tightened, messages poured in, and threats escalated. Yet amidst the chaos, he found a rare clarity. Music became his anchor, his bridge from memory to action. Notes struck against the air, filling the apartment with resonance and resolve. Each chord was defiance. Each pause a calculated shield. By evening, a plan formed. Documents from Hana were organized. Evidence was cataloged. A strategy to release selectively, legally, and effectively emerged. Taehyung was no longer merely reacting. He was orchestrating. The broadcast from earlier became a reference point. Social media shifted, old narratives crumbled. The public began to understand the stakes, the complexity, and the calculated courage it took to stand openly against unseen, powerful forces. He had reclaimed the narrative, not just for himself, but for the memory of the woman whose life had been erased. Night came. The rain had stopped. He sat at the piano, playing softly, notes tender but deliberate. Music filled the empty apartment, and for the first time since the storm began, there was a sense of grounding. Outside, the city continued, oblivious to the battles fought in silence and shadows. The next morning, the city felt different. Social media and news outlets were ablaze with speculation, clips of his previous broadcast dissected endlessly. Taehyung watched quietly from the corner of his apartment, hood still over his head, coffee untouched, letting the waves of chatter roll past him like water. He wasn't reacting, not yet. He was preparing. Yeho entered, eyes scanning the room, nodding the scattered papers, the open laptop streaming real-time reactions, and Taehyung's steady, unreadable expression. "They're trying to spin this," Yeho said. "Old interviews, articles, everything. They want to make you the villain." Taehyung didn't respond immediately. His fingers drummed lightly on the piano's edge. Music had always been his gauge, his anchor, the one metric he trusted. "They can try," he said finally, voice calm, edged with something sharper. "But the truth doesn't bend for convenience." Hana called shortly after, her voice deliberate and firm. "Taehyung, you've set a chain in motion. Do you understand the consequences?" "I do," he replied, eyes fixed on the city skyline, "and I accept them." By midday, he was in the studio again. This time, the cameras were positioned for a special live session. No scripts, no pre-approval, nothing to control his narrative but his own voice. He sat, shoulders squared, gaze steady into the lens, hands folded in front of him. Each breath measured, deliberate as if the air itself could carry authority. "Yesterday I spoke because a line was crossed," he began. "Tonight I speak because that line is just the beginning. My mother's name was used carelessly, as if her life and choices were trivial. But her life, her courage, deserves truth, and I intend to give it." Questions poured in immediately from the live chat. "Who is behind this? What's the proof? Are you safe?" Taehyung ignored the noise, addressing not just the audience but the unseen forces behind the chaos. Each word was calibrated, a careful blend of revelation and warning. He disclosed facts, patterns, and timelines without ever naming names, yet the implications were unmistakable. Hours passed. The live session extended, weaving through confession, reflection, and strategic disclosure. Taehyung's tone shifted naturally from calm to firm, from personal grief to public accountability. He spoke not only as a son avenging his mother, but as an individual confronting a system built to erase and intimidate. Every pause, every deliberate inflection, served as both narrative and shield. Yeho observed from the control room, occasionally nudging notes or reminding him of the live feed. Taehyung responded only with subtle gestures, fully immersed in the rhythm of disclosure. By late evening, the broadcast concluded, but the impact had already rippled outward. Headlines exploded. Discussions fractured and reformed across platforms. Analysts, politicians, and fans tried to decode, dissect, and interpret every nuance of his words. Back in his apartment, Taehyung exhaled slowly. The piano called to him and he sat, hands hovering above the keys. Notes spilled carefully, a mixture of melancholy and defiance. Music, as always, was both catharsis and compass. Each chord anchored him in reality while processing the chaos he had unleashed upon the world. The phone buzzed, another message from Hana. "They're scrambling, you've shifted the balance." Taehyung smiled thinly. Balance was never theirs to control. Security protocols tightened after that. Guards, cameras, and digital firewalls became his new companions. Threats were now concrete, no longer abstract or speculative. Messages ranged from veiled warnings to explicit instructions, compliance or consequence. Taehyung cataloged each one meticulously. He knew the stakes. Days blurred into nights filled with strategy, live updates, and calculated appearances. Interviews were requested, panels scheduled. Each opportunity was a chess piece in the broader game. Taehyung wielded it carefully, never reactive, always deliberate. Each statement, each gesture was crafted to uphold his narrative while protecting the memory of his mother and asserting his own autonomy. A pivotal moment came during a nationally televised round table. Analysts, journalists, and public figures confronted him with veiled accusations and pointed questions. "Do you regret your actions?" a moderator asked. "No," Taehyung replied, eyes steady, voice unwavering. "I regret that these circumstances existed." Every comment, every nuance of tone was dissected by millions watching. Yet Taehyung remained unflinching, his composure a declaration. The past could be exposed without bowing to fear. Outside, the city continued its indifferent pulse, unaware of the seismic shifts taking place in media feeds, courtrooms, and living rooms. But inside, Taehyung felt the first glimmer of agency. He was no longer the passive participant. He had become the orchestrator. Night fell again, and he returned to the piano. Each key pressed reverberated not just with sound, but with resolve. Music had always been a bridge to clarity, and now it served as a vessel of intent. Notes flowed, deliberate, raw, fragmented yet whole. It was a soundtrack to the chaos he had navigated, a map of grief transformed into action. The phone buzzed once more. Hana's voice cut through the darkness. "You've changed the game. The world is watching differently now." "I know," Taehyung replied softly, leaning against the cold window glass. "And I intend to keep it that way." Hours merged into dawn. Light filtered through the blinds, pale and hesitant, brushing across the piano like a benediction. Taehyung sat silently, absorbing the calm before the inevitable storms. The city slept fitfully, the hum of distant traffic and sirens a constant reminder of reality beyond the studio walls. The next few days were a blur of light and shadow. Taehyung moved through the city like a ghost, every street, every alleyway, every cafe and studio layered with a tension he could feel under his skin. He was no longer just a musician or a celebrity. He had become a symbol, an unyielding point in a world desperate to rewrite his narrative. Hana met him again, this time in a quiet, nondescript library. The air was thick with the scent of paper and dust, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She handed him a folder. Inside were documents, photographs, and meticulously logged communications. Proof, undeniable, linking corporate investors, political figures, and shadowed intermediaries to a web of influence, manipulation, and threats. Taehyung flipped through each page, his pulse quickening, anger rising and falling like waves crashing over stone. His mother's handwriting appeared on several documents, annotations and translations that revealed her intellect, her foresight, and her courage. Every note was a reminder of the life stolen from her and the secrecy forced upon him. "They expected silence," Hana said softly, watching him absorb the gravity of each revelation. "They underestimated the cost of truth." Taehyung didn't reply immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he set the folder down. "Then we dismantle it," he said finally. "All of it, step by step." Legal teams were mobilized. Courtrooms became arenas where strategy, patience, and courage collided. Taehyung's testimony was precise, deliberate, grounded in fact, emotion carefully restrained but palpable. The world watched as layers of secrecy were peeled back, evidence after evidence presented, witnesses corroborating details that had long been hidden. Every revelation was a hammer blow to the narrative constructed against them. Outside the courthouse, journalists swarmed. Questions flew like arrows, cameras flashing, recording every expression. Taehyung's composure never wavered. He answered with clarity, with authority, and with the subtle fire that had always lived beneath his calm demeanor. The world, moment by moment, began to grasp the truth. His mother had been a woman of courage, and he had become the torchbearer of her legacy. Back in his apartment after a long day of court proceedings, he returned to the piano. The notes that poured forth were heavy, tempered by grief, but layered with the resolve that had carried him through sleepless nights and relentless scrutiny. Each chord was a testament, a narrative without words, raw and unfiltered. The music filled the space, echoing off the walls, demanding acknowledgement of both loss and resilience. Messages flooded in: support, disbelief, admiration, and attempts at manipulation. Taehyung read none of them. He focused only on the music, on the strategy, on the clarity that had come from embracing the chaos instead of fleeing from it. Hana called intermittently, guiding, warning, advising. Every detail was critical, every move measured. Then came the turning point, the first convictions. The individuals behind the systemic manipulation and threat networks were exposed, some arrested, others under investigation. The media storm shifted. Instead of speculation about him, the scrutiny turned to those who had tried to exploit his family, his history, and his silence. The narrative was finally, publicly inverted. Taehyung's father returned, older, wearier, yet relieved. They spoke at length, unpacking decades of secrets, missteps, and survival tactics. Apologies were exchanged, grief acknowledged, and for the first time the past felt like a shared burden rather than an isolating weight. Through it all, Taehyung maintained his focus. Each performance, each public statement, each strategic action was deliberate. He refused to be reduced to a victim or a pawn. Every decision carried his signature intent, a declaration of autonomy and resilience. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of media appearances and legal consultations, he stood on his balcony, the city sprawling beneath him. Lights glimmered like stars scattered across the asphalt sky. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier, each drop punctuating the night with rhythm and clarity. He lifted his gaze, eyes steady, reflecting the storm both outside and within. "This ends on my terms," he murmured. The wind carried his words into the night, a silent oath to himself and to the memory of his mother. Music called once more. He returned to the piano, letting the melody flow, fragmented but healing. Notes rose and fell, sharp, dissonant, comforting, and commanding. Each chord was a reclamation of space, of identity, of legacy. The room vibrated with sound, a testament to endurance, courage, and truth. By dawn, the city stirred again. Headlines recast, the world adjusting to the reality of exposure, of accountability, of a story told with precision and intention. Taehyung watched from his studio window, quiet, unshaken. He had faced threats, manipulation, and decades of hidden truths, and he had emerged not only unbroken but empowered. The final piece of the puzzle came with a broadcast unlike any before. Taehyung sat alone, no moderator, no control room interference, only his voice, the camera, and the piano. He spoke of his mother not as a victim but as a strategist, a courageous soul navigating impossible circumstances. He revealed the network of deception and threats, the timeline of manipulation, and the facts verified by court proceedings. "Silence can be weaponized," he said. "Truth can be dangerous, but fear cannot dictate my life, nor can it dictate hers. Today I reclaim the story. Today the past is no longer a prison. Today I speak, not just for myself but for every silenced voice." The broadcast ended, and a hush fell over millions of viewers. Then came the applause of acknowledgement, of understanding, of collective reckoning. Sirens and alerts outside became irrelevant against the resonance of integrity, defiance, and music that spoke louder than threats. Taehyung sat at the piano, letting the final chord linger in the air. The room smelled faintly of rain and dust, familiar and grounding. His phone remained silent, save for one message from Hana. "You did it. You honored her." He exhaled, a long, steady release of tension, grief, and resolve. The sun rose slowly, painting the city with light that carried promise rather than fear. Taehyung leaned back, letting his hands rest on the keys, and for the first time in weeks he felt the calm of agency, the clarity of purpose, and the quiet joy of a story finally told on his terms. Days bled into nights and nights into rehearsals, press briefings, and private strategy sessions. Taehyung moved through each day with the discipline of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, someone who understood that every move, every word, every expression could ripple far beyond his control. Yet, for the first time in years, there was clarity in that chaos. The storm outside could rage. Inside, he held his ground. Hana remained a constant, a shadow guiding him through unseen currents. She provided updates on lingering threats, offered insight on the network still watching, and reminded him that exposure was a double-edged sword. She didn't coddle him. She didn't dramatize the danger. She simply provided the facts, and that alone was empowering. Taehyung spent hours at the piano each day, letting the music carry fragments of memory and truth, blending grief, rage, and resolve into melodies that felt like both confession and declaration. He discovered nuances in old compositions, notes and progressions he hadn't remembered creating, as if his subconscious had been cataloging every suppressed emotion, every unspoken thought, and translating it into sound. Meanwhile, the world continued to react. Social media was ablaze. Debates, think pieces, interviews, and commentary dissected his every word, his every action. Some celebrated his courage, others questioned his motives. Yet amidst the noise, a subtle shift occurred. People began to see the complexity of truth, the impossibility of hiding legacy, and the resilience required to confront it publicly. Taehyung's narrative had taken on a life of its own, but he was no longer a passive participant. He was the author. A public forum was scheduled, a televised discussion that could either solidify his position or open new avenues of attack. Taehyung prepared meticulously, rehearsing answers, anticipating questions, and planning pivots that were factual, precise, and controlled. When the cameras rolled, the moderator's initial smiles were tight, calculating. But Taehyung's presence, a combination of calm authority and unflinching intensity, shifted the room immediately. He spoke without hesitation, framing every answer in terms of truth and accountability, never speculation or emotion-driven conjecture. Each response was measured, a reflection of preparation, intellect, and the quiet fire that had propelled him through years of careful observation and covert danger. Panelists pressed for sensationalism, but he deflected with elegance and firmness. The narrative had changed. He was no longer reactive, no longer cornered. He was the focal point, controlling the dialogue rather than being controlled. Behind the scenes, his team coordinated a sequence of releases, additional documents verified, statements from experts secured, and corroborating evidence queued for public release. Every action was strategic, designed to reinforce the integrity of his narrative while dismantling the constructed myths surrounding his mother's past. Taehyung observed it all with measured detachment, yet beneath the calm, a deep satisfaction pulsed. He was finally reclaiming the story on his terms. The nights became a rhythm of reflection, music, and planning. Taehyung sometimes sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker through his studio windows, letting the resonance of his piano notes fade into the quiet. Memories of his mother, the warmth of her voice, the subtle grace of her hands, the courage she displayed in secrecy, were never far from him. They were both a compass and a charge, guiding every decision, every note, every word. Then came the final confrontation, a closed-door meeting with remaining stakeholders attempting to manipulate public perception and suppress evidence. Taehyung entered the room with quiet authority, exuding a calm that belied the storm beneath. He presented facts, documentation, and a timeline so precise it was impossible to contest. Legal representatives watched, auditors recorded, and the weight of truth settled over the room like an unshakable force. He spoke with measured clarity. Attempts to silence legacy, to manipulate truth, will not succeed. The past belongs to those who lived it, and the consequences of deceit are now public. Every action taken in the shadows will be accounted for. His words carried not just conviction but inevitability. There was no room for misinterpretation. There was no escape from accountability. By dawn, the world was awake to the reality Taehyung had revealed. Press cycles shifted, commentators analyzed, journalists documented, and the public witnessed a transformation. Taehyung was no longer just a celebrity reacting to events beyond his control. He was a conductor of narrative, a guardian of truth, a man refusing to let history be rewritten without his consent. He returned to the piano one final time, letting the melodies express what words could not. Each chord resonated with grief, relief, and resolve. The music filled the studio like a tangible testament to endurance. He allowed himself a rare moment of release, letting tears fall, unashamed, unguarded. It was a catharsis long denied, a quiet acknowledgement of survival, of honor, and of love. Messages and calls continued, but Taehyung remained focused. Hana's updates became advisory rather than urgent. His father, reconciled with the truth, offered support and counsel. The threats that had once defined every waking moment were now contained, documented, and publicly acknowledged. Taehyung had shifted the balance. The narrative belonged to him. Finally, Taehyung stood on his balcony as the sun rose, bathing the city in pale gold. Rain washed the streets clean, and the air carried a scent of renewal. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of weeks lift incrementally. The world would continue to challenge, to scrutinize, to speculate. But Taehyung had learned something unshakable. Control over self, narrative, and legacy was more powerful than fear. The piano remained a companion, a confessor, a testament. He pressed the keys gently, letting sound echo into the quiet apartment. The city outside moved relentlessly, indifferent yet alive, but inside, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was peace. Not the absence of challenge, but the presence of agency, truth, and purpose.